Functions, I like to organize my code a little differently. We're creating an awful lot of global variables here, and global variables are bad. Let's not do that. Instead, how about we wrap this whole thing in an object? And in fact, we're using ES6. So we have some newer syntax. It's worth pointing out. JavaScript is an object-oriented programming language, but it is not a classical object-oriented programming language. That is, it doesn't use class inheritance. It uses prototypal inheritance, which is a whole different thing, and we're not really going to get into it. But it's just worth pointing out, we do not actually have true classes in JavaScript, despite the fact that in ES6 they added the class keyword. So we're going to make a class. Just know that as far as the way inheritance works, it's not strictly speaking the way that classes work in other languages. It's prototypal inheritance, not class inheritance. Nevertheless, we have the class keyword as of ES6. So you should know that classes are relatively new in JavaScript, and they don't quite work the same way that you're used to. But we aren't going to get into any scenarios where the differences actually matter a whole lot. So what I'd like to do is put this whole thing inside a class so that I don't have so many dang global variables. I'll have methods instead. All right, let's just start at the top. Let's make a class. We're going to name our classes with capital letters, like we do in some other languages, like app. It's good enough for me. So what actually needs to happen when the page loads? What action actually takes place when the page loads? Mostly we're just creating some functions here. What's actually happening when the page loads? Now look through the code here. What is not a function declaration here? So this isn't, right? Function, 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 and this isn't. So when the page first loads, we're grabbing a form off the page, and we're listening for it to be submitted. Those are really the only two things that happen right at the beginning, right? So where would you put those two things? In a class. I like it. Let's do it. So to make a constructor, it's really clever. Yeah. So the methods in a class, you can just write like this. Name of method, parentheses, curly braces. And if you just name a function constructor, you've got yourself a constructor. So in there, we're just going to grab the form off the page, and we're going to start listening for it to be submitted. And that's all we do when the page first loads, right? So we just need to make sure that when the page loads, we actually initialize one of these. So we can just say new app like that. Totally works. And then we wouldn't have made any global variables at all. Now, for the sake of troubleshooting, because we're going to have some debugging along the way here, we probably want to be able to get to this object in the console. So I'm going to say const lowercase app equals new app. So we're going to create a new instance of the class, and we're going to save it to a variable just so we can fiddle with it in the console. If we didn't need to do that, I wouldn't even bother, and I would just say new app. But yeah, this does just what you think. It runs the constructor and saves the resulting instance to a variable. All right, so to make this work, we need to call handle submit. But we're going to make all of these functions methods on this object, right? So let's start the work of converting those. You have render property, render item, blah, blah, blah. I'm just going to copy and paste for now. Or cut and paste. Let's just throw them in there. So instead of const render property equals function, just get rid of const, get rid of equals function. And now it's a method. Cool. Render item. const render item equals function. Just get rid of const, get rid of equal function. Now it's a method. Handle submit, get rid of const, get rid of equal function. Now it's a method. Piece of cake. Now we're all object-oriented and stuff. Feels good. Of course, none of this is going to work, but one thing at a time. That's okay. We committed, so if we just make a huge mess of things, we can always get back. So what's not going to work? Heck, let's just test it out. Let's see what kind of errors we get. Refresh. Oh, right away. Handle submit is not defined. Because the constructor runs right off the bat, right? It sees handle submit and says, I don't know what the heck you're talking about. Handle submit is no longer just a function named handle submit. It's a method of this object, right? So how do I call it? Say that again? Yeah. So there's got to be a way to access stuff on the same object from inside that object, right? And in JavaScript, that's this. Now this, I've said several things are your new best friend, right? This is your new worst enemy. This does not always behave the way that you think it ought to. But yeah, inside an object, you can refer to the current object as this. So that means this instance of the app has a method called handle submit. And that's the function I want here. Cool. So what I expect to happen next is that error message will go away and we'll get a new error message. No problem. That's progress. We should celebrate when that happens. So we had handle submit is not defined. No errors. The whole thing's going to work. Great. So the constructor totally worked. We totally set up our event listener, which is all we were trying to do, right? Now when we actually try to run this thing, that's another story. So intro flick. We got anything more obscure? What else has that Pine fellow been in? I don't know. He was in a Jack Ryan something or other. I think it might have just been called Jack Ryan. Shadow something, right? Shadow thingy. Jack Ryan, shadow thingy. Which Chris? Pine. Here we go. I'm submitting. Let's see what happens. Explode! Render item is not defined. No problem. We're just going to be going around and adding a bunch of this dots, right? Piece of cake. It even tells me which line it's on. Line 40. Yeah, if you click there, it takes you right to the line over here. But I need to do it in my source code. So on line 40, render item is not defined. Line 40, render item. No prob. This dot render item. So remember, we had line 40, render item is not defined. Cool. Jack Ryan, who cares? Pine. Line 40, this dot render item is not a function. Cool. What? What? It's right there. What's going on here? We have been betrayed by this because this is an untrustworthy scoundrel. What's going on here? What do you mean this dot render item is not a function? So what's your suspicion here? My suspicion is that this is not what we think it is. Not that render item suddenly ceased to be a function. Render item is totally a method on this object. So this must not be this object, even though I just told you inside of this refers to the object. So what gives? All right. Inside handle submit, that's where line 40 is, right? I'm just going to throw debugger in here. Don't forget that you can do that if you have no idea what's going on. Refresh, inner flick, who cares? All right, here we are. So what's this? It's not the object, it's the form. Well, as it turns out, the value of this inside a function is not determined by how you wrote that function, but how you called that function. This gets bound to the function. That's what we call it when we set the value of this inside a function. This gets bound to the function at the time that you call it. So it doesn't matter that handle submit is a method on this object. What matters is the way it was called was as an event handler. We weren't the ones who called it, right? If we called this dot handle submit like this, then we're calling it as a method. Of course, that's not what we want to do here, but that would call it as a method. And then anytime you call a function like this, something dot something open close parens, you can bet that inside that function, this is going to be bound to whatever was on the left side of that dot. But we're not the ones who called handle submit. Handle submit was called automatically when an event fired. And anytime a function is called because an event fire, it's always going to bind this to the target of the event. That's just how it works, which is kind of a bummer because that's not what we wanted to happen. But that's how it works. So how can we deal with that? Take just a moment to think. How could we deal with that? The problem is it decides how to set this at the time that you call the function, and we're not the ones calling handle submit. If we called it ourselves, this would be bound the way we wanted. But instead, it's an event handler, and anytime JavaScript calls a function for us as an event handler, this always gets set to the target of the event. So how can we get around this? Take just a moment to think about it. Event handlers always bind this the way we don't want. We can always get the target through event.target, so we don't need this. So what could we do? If we call something as a method, it binds it the way we want. But if it's an event handler, it's bound the way we don't want. So how could we make this what we want inside handle submit? Troy?
If we called this as like this with the handle submit outside of it and then put it in the event handler after we've already like called it something else.
So what if handle submit weren't the event handler? What if the event handler were a different function that called handle submit? So what about this? What if we have some other function here? And that function calls this.handle submit. You dig? Does that line of thinking make some sense, at least? Cool, this should solve all our problems. Let's try it out. What? What just happened? We didn't prevent default, did we? Why not? Oh, we prevent default down here. We need to prevent default inside this. This is the event handler now, right? Okay, okay. This is the event handler. No problem. And down in handle submit, let's see. Okay, we don't need to prevent default here anymore. We already did it. But we do need the event target. So we still need the event in here. So let's just make sure that we pass it along, okay? So now this is the event handler, so it's going to prevent default. Then it's going to call handle submit and pass the event along. That should get us past that error. What? Now this.handle submit is not a function on line 6. Why not? Well, now this function is an event handler, and so inside that function, this isn't going to be what we want. Gosh dang it. Still, I like where your head's at. I like this way of thinking. Don't worry. We have a fix for this. We can handle this. It's no problem. Ladies and gentlemen, my other favorite feature of ES6, the arrow function. Anybody seen arrow functions before? What's an arrow function? But you've seen it. What's it look like? Yeah, equal sign greater than. So what you do, instead of using the keyword function, you put parentheses, the argument list, arrow, equal greater than. So it's a shorter syntax for creating functions, which with anonymous functions is kind of nice. It clutters up your code a little less once you get used to seeing them. But it behaves a little different than declaring it with the function keyword too. In one very important way. It binds this the way you want it to. That's pretty much the difference. If you use arrow functions, it's not going to screw up the binding of this. This is going to be the same thing inside that function as it was on the line where you made the function. So an arrow function is just going to solve, I wouldn't say all our problems, but this problem. Let's try it out. Good. We're way down the line now. All right. Render property is not defined on line 27. Line 27. Okay. Render property is not defined. All right. What function is render property inside? What function are we inside here on line 27? We are inside render item. We're also inside this function, right? So how about we just change this function to an arrow function? This little anonymous function inside for each. Because inside render item, this should be the right thing. But inside this anonymous function, it's going to get screwed up again. Because again, we're not the ones calling this function, for each is calling it for us. So this is going to end up being heaven knows what. It's going to be window, the global object, which is completely useless. All right. That should take care of that. Render property is not defined on line 27. How about I put this dot render property, right? There we are. That wasn't so bad. So arrow functions just solved an awful lot of our problems. And now everything's inside a class. So again, all we did was refactor. We just organized our code differently. Why? Well, sooner or later we're going to get to React. And when we use React, we're going to be using classes. So it'd be nice if we weren't seeing a class for the first time. Cool. So use an ES6 class and arrow functions. So arrow functions give us a nice way to make sure the binding of this is what we want it to be. And classes give us a new way to structure our code so that we don't have a bunch of global variables. And it just feels better. It feels better to be using a class, I think. Doesn't it feel good? Does it make you feel warm inside? No, not so much. All right, well, I feel better.